Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, I've gathered some of the most chilling and unsettling encounters from ordinary places, hotels, rooms, and hallways where people expected nothing but a quiet night, only to experience the inexplicable. These aren't the kinds of tales that end with clear answers or neat explanations. Instead, they'll leave you wondering what might be lurking in the places we take for granted, just out of sight, waiting. So, turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a night of real-life horror stories that may make you think twice about your next hotel stay. First story, the hotel room that should have stayed locked. It happened a few years ago, and to this day, I still get chills thinking about it. I was on a business trip, staying at a hotel that I hadn't researched much. It wasn't anything fancy, just a basic, no-frills place that was near the venue where I had a meeting scheduled. I was too focused on work to care about luxury. All I needed was a bed to crash on at the end of the day. From the moment I stepped into the lobby, though, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just this odd sensation that the air felt heavier than usual, like walking into a room where people had been fighting, except there was no one there but me and the receptionist. She barely made eye contact and handed me the key to my room without saying much. Room 302. It wasn't until I got to the elevator that I noticed the peculiar detail. There was no button for the third floor. The floors went from 1, 2, and then straight to 4. Thinking it was just a mistake or some weird hotel quirk, I went back to the receptionist to clarify. "Excuse me, but I think there's an issue with the elevator. It doesn't have a button for the third floor." She froze, her eyes wide for a second before she quickly regained her composure. "Oh, you'll have to use the stairs for that one. The elevator doesn't go to the third floor anymore." "Anymore?" She didn't answer. Just nodded towards the stairwell and went back to her paperwork. Not wanting to make a fuss, I grabbed my bag and headed for the stairs. Each step echoed loudly as I climbed, the air growing colder with every flight. When I reached the third floor, it was dimly lit, with that old, musty smell of a place that hadn't been touched in years. The carpet was faded, the walls cracked in places, and every door looked like it had seen better days. I found room 302 at the far end of the hall. The door looked older than the others, almost like it had been replaced and then forgotten. I fumbled with the key, feeling strangely uneasy, but finally, the lock clicked and the door creaked open. The room was basic, bed, desk, TV mounted on the wall. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that strange feeling from earlier had returned, only stronger now. The air was thick, and there was this faint smell, something between damp wood and rot. I chalked it up to an old building and tried to ignore it. That night, though, I barely slept. I kept hearing these soft, muffled noises, like whispers coming from the walls or the ceiling. At first, I thought it might be other guests in nearby rooms. But when I remembered the elevator, it hit me. I hadn't seen anyone else on the third floor. No other doors had looked disturbed, and the hall had been dead silent. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps right outside my door. They were slow, deliberate, and stopped just as they reached my room. I held my breath, listening intently. After a few seconds of silence, there was a knock, 3 slow, hollow knocks. I didn't move. I stared at the door, heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, without warning, the doorknob began to turn. It wasn't fast or violent, just a slow, agonizing twist as if whoever was on the other side was taking their time. But I had locked it. I jumped out of bed, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a lamp, and stood ready to defend myself. The doorknob stopped moving, and whoever, or whatever, was outside seemed to retreat. I stood frozen, barely daring to breathe, until eventually, the footsteps faded down the hall. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I rushed downstairs and demanded to check out early. The receptionist didn't seem surprised. In fact, she barely reacted. As she handed me the receipt, I noticed something. The room number printed at the top wasn't 302. It was 402. I pointed it out to her, thinking there had been a mistake. She looked up at me, her face pale, and said quietly, "We don't rent out room 302 anymore." Not after what happened. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had knocked on my door that night wasn't a mistake. It was something that had been waiting, and I had been the one who let it in. Second story, the unwanted guest in room 108. This happened when I was on a solo road trip, driving through a small, almost forgotten town. It was late, and I was exhausted after driving for hours without stopping. There were no big chains, no recognizable places to rest, so when I saw a small motel with a flickering neon sign, I decided to pull over for the night. It wasn't fancy, just one of those old, run-down roadside motels with a handful of rooms, but it would do. I walked into the office, and the man at the counter looked like he had seen better days. His graying hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled, and there was this odd vibe about him, like he had been sitting behind that counter for decades. He barely glanced at me, just slid the key across the counter and mumbled, "Room 108. I asked if there was anything nearby to eat, and he just shrugged, saying the diner down the road had closed years ago. You'll be lucky if you find a vending machine that still works. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too tired to care about food or anything else. All I wanted was to get to my room and pass out. Room 108 was in the middle of the row, a couple of rooms down from the office. As soon as I unlocked the door, I was hit by this musty, stale smell, like the room hadn't been aired out in a long time. The furniture looked ancient, with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, and the carpet had stains that I didn't even want to think about. But it was late, and I wasn't picky. I threw my bag on the bed, planning to shower and crash, but before I could even sit down, I noticed something odd. The closet door was slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, just enough that I could see the darkness inside. I figured housekeeping had just forgotten to close it after cleaning, so I walked over and pulled it shut. As soon as I did, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. A sigh. I froze, thinking maybe it was the pipes or the wind, but the room was silent again. The air felt thicker now, like I wasn't alone. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Long drive, fatigue, it was getting to me. I turned on the TV for some background noise and headed to the bathroom to take a quick shower. The water pressure was terrible, and the lights above the mirror flickered slightly, but I was too tired to care. After a few minutes, I turned off the water and reached for the towel. That's when I heard it again. The sigh. Only this time, it was louder. Closer. It sounded like someone standing right outside the bathroom door. My heart started racing, and I quickly wrapped the towel around myself, creeping towards the door. I pressed my ear against it, trying to listen for any movement, but there was nothing. Silence. Cautiously, I opened the door and stepped out into the room. Empty. But the closet door was open again. Not slightly ajar this time, wide open. I stood there, staring at it, trying to figure out if I had somehow left it open before. But I knew I hadn't. I had closed it. I was sure of it. My instincts screamed at me to grab my stuff and leave, but part of me didn't want to believe anything was wrong. I mean, how could there be? It was just an old, run-down motel. These places have creaks and groans from years of neglect, right? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I sat on the edge of the bed, keeping my eyes on the closet, my mind racing. And then, out of nowhere, the TV shut off. The room plunged into silence. No hum of the air conditioner, no sound from the road outside. Just dead silence. That's when I heard the breathing. Slow. Deep. Coming from the closet. I wasn't going to wait to find out what it was. I jumped up, grabbed my bag, and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. As I ran towards my car, I glanced back at room 108, and I swear I saw the curtain move, like someone was watching me leave. I didn't bother checking out. I drove until I hit the next town, found another motel, and didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, out of sheer curiosity, I called the motel. I needed to know if what I had experienced was real or just the result of exhaustion. The same man answered the phone, his voice as indifferent as the night before. When I asked him about room 108, he paused for a moment, then said, "We haven't rented that room out in years." I asked why, and his answer sent chills down my spine. No one ever stays the whole night. Third story, the room at the end of the hall. I had been traveling for a few weeks, moving from city to city for work, and by the time I checked into this hotel, I was beyond exhausted. It was one of those older, historic hotels that had clearly been around for decades, maybe even longer. It had a certain charm, but there was also something unsettling about its age. The front desk was manned by a woman who looked like she had worked there for years, her expression blank, almost robotic. After checking in, she handed me the key to my room, room 217, located at the far end of the longest hallway I had ever seen. The hotel wasn't very full, and the hallways were eerily quiet, the carpet muffling the sound of my footsteps as I dragged my suitcase along. Every door I passed was shut tight, and there wasn't a single sound coming from any of the rooms. It was strange, given the size of the hotel. When I finally reached room 217, something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but as soon as I put the key in the door, this wave of unease washed over me. The air felt colder, almost like the temperature had dropped several degrees in just that part of the hallway. I brushed it off as tiredness. After all, I had been on the road for days and just needed to sleep. The room itself was ordinary, nothing stood out, but that unsettling feeling lingered. The bed was neatly made, the furniture old but clean, and the window overlooked the street below. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I unpacked, I noticed something odd. There was a second door in the room. It was locked and had no handle, just a small keyhole at the center. I figured it was a connecting door to the next room, something I had seen in older hotels before. But when I checked the room number next door earlier, it was 219. Where was room 218? I ignored it, trying to focus on getting some rest. I had a long day ahead, and the last thing I needed was to freak myself out over some old hotel quirks. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The room was too quiet, almost unnervingly so. I kept hearing this faint tapping sound, like something lightly knocking against the wall. At first, I thought it might be the pipes or even the wind, but it kept coming from the direction of the locked door. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers up and shutting my eyes tight. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone was gently knocking from the other side. My heart started racing, and I sat up in bed, staring at the door. The sound stopped. Just as I began to relax, there was a knock, this time, louder and deliberate, coming from that same door. I froze. My mind raced with all sorts of explanations, none of them making sense. There was no room 218, no one should be on the other side. I grabbed my phone, checking the time. It was just after 3 a.m. The witching hour, some call it. I laughed nervously at the thought, but the laughter quickly faded when I heard it again, 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. I jumped out of bed and approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the keyhole. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see, maybe just darkness, but when I bent down and peeked through, my blood ran cold. On the other side of the door, I saw an eye. It wasn't just looking through the keyhole, it was staring directly at me. The skin around the eye was pale, almost translucent, and the eye itself was wide open, unblinking. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. Whoever, whatever, was on the other side didn't make a sound after that. The knocking stopped, and the room fell deathly silent. I didn't dare approach the door again. Instead, I grabbed my bag, threw on my clothes, and bolted out of the room. I didn't even stop at the front desk to check out. I just left the key on the counter and drove until I found another hotel. I don't know what was in that room or what was on the other side of that door, but I didn't care. I just knew I wasn't staying to find out. Fourth story, the night I spent in room 315. It wasn't supposed to be anything out of the ordinary. Just another work trip, another quick stop at a budget hotel in a small town I barely remember the name of. The kind of place where you don't expect luxury, just a clean bed and a hot shower. But that night, I found out that even the most unremarkable places can hide something sinister. I arrived late, probably close to midnight. The parking lot was mostly empty, and the lobby was dimly lit, with only one person behind the counter, a young guy who looked more interested in his phone than his job. He handed me the key to room 315 without even looking up. Room 315 was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long, narrow hallway. As I made my way down, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. No sounds of other guests, no TVs, no voices, just the muffled hum of the old fluorescent lights flickering overhead. It felt abandoned. But it was late, and I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to get to my room and sleep. When I opened the door, the room was exactly what I expected, plain, a bit rundown, but clean enough. There was a strange smell, though, like the room hadn't been used in a while, that stale odor of dust and neglect. The bed was pushed against the far wall, and there was an old, wooden wardrobe standing in the corner. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I shrugged it off. After all, it was just a place to sleep for one night. I unpacked a little and settled in, but as the night went on, I started to notice little things that didn't feel right. First, it was the temperature. The room was cold. I mean, freezing. I fiddled with the thermostat, but no matter how much I turned it up, the cold wouldn't go away. It wasn't just the kind of cold that made you uncomfortable, it was the kind of cold that sinks into your bones, that makes you feel like something is wrong. Then came the noises. At first, I thought it was the building settling, those little creaks and groans that old places make. But these sounds were different. They were rhythmic, almost deliberate. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving around inside the walls. I tried to distract myself with my phone, but the connection was spotty, and I couldn't get any signal. Frustrated, I decided to just try and sleep. I pulled the covers over myself, but the cold still clung to me. That's when I heard it. A knock. It was soft at first, almost like a light tap, coming from the door of the wardrobe. I sat up, staring at it, my pulse quickening. I knew I had closed it when I entered the room. It had been shut tight. Then, there it was again. 3 soft knocks, like someone, no, something, was inside, waiting. I froze, my eyes locked on the wardrobe. Every fiber of my being was telling me not to move, not to go near it. But my curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I got out of bed and approached the door. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment, trembling. I could feel the cold radiating from it, like there was something on the other side that didn't belong. With a deep breath, I pulled the door open. Nothing. The wardrobe was empty, just a dark, hollow space. But that didn't explain the knocks, or the feeling that I was being watched. I quickly shut the door and backed away, my heart racing. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, just exhaustion from the long trip. But then the knocking started again, this time louder, more insistent. It was coming from inside the wardrobe. I didn't even think. I grabbed my things and rushed out of the room, leaving the door wide open behind me. As I reached the elevator, I heard it, one final, loud bang, like something had thrown itself against the door of the wardrobe. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the hotel, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But deep down, I knew there was no explanation that would satisfy me. I never reported it. Never told anyone at the hotel. I just drove away and didn't look back. Thank you for joining us tonight. These stories remind us that sometimes, even the most mundane places can hold secrets we're not meant to uncover. Next time you find yourself alone in a quiet hotel room or passing through an empty hallway, pay close attention. What you might brush off as just old building noises could be something much more. If you have a story of your own, we'd love to hear it in the comments. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.